The class of 2030, the year we're all pointing to as critical for change, is starting here in a few weeks. That we're going to see more change in the next 5 years as far as economics, structuring, jobs, the workforce than we did in the last 200 years. How specifically is AI going to impact my field? That's the best thing that faculty can do right now to benefit their students. You really need visionary leadership that can see beyond the problems that we're having right now. Really, the big one is going to be identity and tradition, right? So that being, that's what we're talking about with computer science and English faculty. If it can do what you do, then who are you now?
Today, we are delighted to welcome Dr. James Hutson, a leading expert at the nexus of art history, AI, and immersive technology. Dr. Hutson currently serves as the lead XR disruptor and department head of art, history, AI, and visual culture at Lindenwood University. His impressive background includes advanced degrees in both art history and artificial intelligence, culminating with his PhD in AI in December of 2023. Over his career, he's taught more than 120 online courses, developed 26 online degree programs, 4 of which are ranked in the nation's top 5, and overseen the creation of 38 additional academic offerings. He's also the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Emerging and Disruptive Innovation in Education, and the author of a number of recent books and journal publications on AI, advanced technologies, and education. Welcome, Dr. Hutson. Thank you for joining us. We're thrilled to have you as our inaugural guest.
Glad to be here. I'm sure would love to share what we've been doing with you.
All right. And, given your background and extensive publication history, there's so many topics we could cover here today. But, as our inaugural guest on our AI and higher education podcast, we'd like to focus our time on the impact of AI on universities, including challenges and opportunities. But, first, as a bit of background, what first attracted you to the intersection of art, technology, and AI in education?
Exactly. The trajectory should sound familiar to many as we're moving into a period in which one does not focus on merely one thing. We're actually moving into a period of the generalists that can do many more things that cross disciplinary lines. So my story will probably sound more familiar once we get to 2030 because many people will be adding new tools to their tool belt and new skills, new certifications, etc. So my story started off like most of the higher education professionals that might be listening to this. I went through traditional schooling. My father was an artist. I got a degree in art, went on for a master's in art history. And as you continually progress, you develop a sense of your specialization, your degree being of singular focus and importance, right? So that being that it can address many of the problems out there, just like if you talk to those in computer science or mathematics or philosophy, right? So that's what it means to be a professor. You profess your love for a given discipline. And so I started off really traditional. I came out here in 2010 to set up the art history department, solely focused on that, solely focused on art historical research, presenting at CAA, publishing the book as I was supposed to, publishing my articles within my narrow discipline. And then I was given an administrative role where I was asked to make those online and graduate programs that you were mentioning, which I knew nothing about, but you kind of back up. So you start with like a 100-foot view, you then back up, to your 10,000-foot view, and you start to see the bigger picture of where your discipline actually sits within this larger picture. And so with that, I went back and got additional degrees, set up an XR lab, which is where the XR thing comes from, as we were trying to develop ways in which to connect student-to-student interaction and student-to-faculty interaction right before and during the pandemic. So realized that had a lot to do with game engines. So to teach myself Unity and Unreal, I knew I needed some accountability. So I got another grad degree in that. I knew nothing about the business behind higher ed, so I got another business degree. So I could shore up those deficiencies. And with each one, you realize your initial role looks smaller and smaller and smaller in this large ecosystem that's actually even one university. So with that, I mean, obviously the pandemic catapulted billions of dollars of R&D into XR research with the metaverse. And then 2022, actually 2021, I was given the mandate when we reorganized to start looking at how AI was already impacting higher education. Luckily, I had colleagues in in the College of Humanities, believe it or not, that could already code in Python, but we're teaching poetry, right? So we're already looking at these intersections, these overlaps. So we started, developing our own algorithm, seeing how that might impact how creative writing students consider their creative process, etc. And then, of course, fall of 22, we did a number of studies, the last writing tool of which, and we did studies in how it impacted art and design, web design and development, drawing, composition. So all of that then ended with the launch of ChatGPT. So at that point, that kind of launched over 200 publications. I had to count them up as well, with over 100 international partners, and each time a problem came up, I realized that more and more you needed different perspectives and specializations to solve them. And so we started crossing further lines of not only departmental lines, college lines, universities, but then national and international lines to find those specializations. And so that's when I knew I had to get a PhD in AI because I saw which way the wind was blowing and how important that was going to be. And then that just kind of naturally developed. So that's kind of the trajectory that it took is looking at what skills do we actually need to accomplish the job at hand, and then looking at where we're going. And that's kind of the main message we have with all of our research is we have to be, forward thinking and consider not what was, but preparing our students for what will be.
That is a fascinating background story, and in particular, the way it kind of melds traditional approaches to academia and study and areas of expertise to then developing this understanding of generalist with areas of expertise. And I think you're right at the beginning when you said this is what it's going to look like in 2030 for many of us. One thing that you also noted that I want to pick on and to be able to develop is the rate of change that we're seeing. It's the rate of improvement in many of the models or the technologies, the architectures, technology adoption, awareness of AI has grown rapidly, but that awareness is sometimes fairly superficial in terms of what that might mean for, higher education for our institutions. Tell us a little bit about how that shift has affected your work, your outlook. You've talked about it in terms of your approach to some areas of expertise. How do you try to grow awareness then within your institution or within academia, and how does that spill over into society? And maybe those are different approaches, but thinking about how do you communicate some of that, how do you navigate some of it, and help others do so?
Exactly. Yeah, you're right. That is two different approaches. And so I do try both sides, that being looking at educating and upskilling. We have a big workforce development initiative happening right now in my own college, which is Arts and Humanities, which is where AI is located in my institution, which is fairly unusual. But so we have that from community centers to Rotary clubs to economic development councils, right? So we have that side of it, and really on that side, as far as awareness is concerned, it's meeting people where they're at and demonstrating what the impact will be on them, their area, their jobs, their lifestyle, etc. So it's relatively straightforward. Concerns about upskilling, job displacement, ethics, privacy, things like that. What they want to know about for their children, for deep fakes in the media, etc. But then you have the institutional side, which is a whole different beast in and of itself. And what's interesting is I'm much more effective at demonstrating the coming wave, right? As CEO Microsoft kind of put it, external, right, to my institution and ecosystem, right, which is kind of interesting. But the way in which we've done it, we tried the traditional route, which is doing human subject research, dozens and dozens of studies, right. So we did them from community colleges. Luckily, we had partners across the North America. So community colleges in Arizona. I'm actually at a teaching institution, believe it or not. Vocational schools, historically black colleges, colleges, state schools, and R1. So we did studies on all of them, bring that back and saying this is what's actually happening right in the classroom. It's not theoretical. This is the impact it's going to have. But with each advancement that you mentioned, it became more and more pressing as far as trying to say, this is not something that we need to kick the can on and think about assessment in the future, think about curricular design, think about even what coursework looks like, which is really what's happening. That's the inertia, right, that we'll talk about later. But the way in which we attempt to do it really is to demonstrate the practical and the current impact it's having in the classroom and in their discipline and how they're teaching and how the tools, once again, are affecting the outcomes that they're looking for with students because the students can do different things with different disciplines. And the different disciplines also have different identities, right, that they consider for themselves. So, for instance, many disciplines that are performative in nature feel no rush in order to address this. That's why I'm working with our head of the theater department. But if you think about something like dance, it's like, what are they worried about in dance or anything where they're performing when it comes to AI? Okay, well, that's something we'll worry about later. They should worry about it now. We can talk about why. But, things about exercise science, right? So things that are really out of reach for non-embodied AI. But remember, embodied AI is coming. Well, it's already here, but it's going to become more widely accessible by the end of the year. So that's kind of, we did keynotes, we did traditional books, traditional articles, international presentations. We just were at the State Department in South Korea with 21 Southeast Asian nations, as much as possible, kind of speaking the language of academia of, here's what this means for pedagogy, for curriculum development, for administration, etc. But really with mixed results, quite honestly.
Let me pick up on that point about embodied AI because this is something that we've talked quite a bit about and we really want to explore further with what it might mean for academia. How have your colleagues in dance or theater responded when you've talked to them about those upcoming threats? They really need to start addressing them now because it does look, if you're just looking at ChatGPT, for instance, and you're thinking about a chatbot, I could see the disconnect thinking there's no way that could ever encroach on the work I'm doing with students with body movement. But how do they address that? How do you talk to them about that?
Sure. So, luckily, we were working with various departments, including the performing arts, right, during the pandemic and right after, because of the XR lab. So, doing things like motion capture technology, looking at ways in which to improve, kinesthetics and movement, reducing injuries, right, during practice for ballet or modern or tap. And so, with that, you normally get this sense in the same way that nurses would in a hospital in an ER. They call it alarm fatigue, that being they hear so much that there are things they have to pay attention to, they shut down. And so we have, and that's what we were doing in institutional studies. We keep getting qualitative feedback going, oh, this is just another shiny thing that the university is chasing. Oh, this is just, another one of those tech things that's going to pass. And that's what we heard, like last year from many of our studies oh, no, it hit a plateau. It's not going to last, right? It's going to go away. So really they feel even you try to demonstrate that and discuss what embodied AI means when you're going to have robots that also have these capabilities in the real world with us. They're thinking, hey, I just got through a pandemic. I just learned how to teach remotely. I just learned how to, once again, start thinking about VR in my classroom and XR and motion capture. And so they're just like, okay, so, slow down. And that's how a lot of them feel is the change is too fast, too much, too soon.
Now, how, you know, you talk really in a way about the humanities, right? Like the first introduction a lot of, professors had to AI was, of course, in late December, finals times, right? ChatGPT 3.5 is out and the kids are using it, to write their papers. And of course, now it's much better, right? It's more accurate, it hallucinates less, the top models are doing all kinds of things to use tools to verify what they're doing. And, of course, just yesterday, we saw the release of ChatGPT 5, which incorporates kind of all the different functionalities into one platform. And it's freely available, at least for limited use, right? You get so many queries that you can use this. Any student can use it. We see we see Gemini offering their basically top model to students for free for the year. So how would you say, first of all, maybe even awareness of this, as we're coming up into the fall semester, are faculty even kind of aware of the developments, a significant improvement of the tools, and that students have free access to them? And second, like, how are they responding to that? Are they changing their assessments, or do you see people just still like, I mean, I see it a little bit on LinkedIn, writing detectors. I saw somebody publish like a 5-point series against writing detectors, and I was thinking, oh, I can't even read anything else about writing detectors. To me, it's just such a debate that's kind of been passed by. It's over in my mind. But I still see a lot of that with faculty. But in your position, maybe your university or all this collaboration, you've done with other universities. How do you see the faculty reaction?
The reaction is really varied department by department. So, for instance, I would say the majority of fact. We should also say in our research we can get to later that roughly half the population will not adapt well to these technologies for very personal, psychological, and existential reasons. So we need to kind of start there, in which that some will never change their classes, never change how they think they're going to assess, because they are the domain experts, they're the subject matter experts, and so they know better. So, for instance, in our research, computer science and English professors have the most staunch resistance globally. And why is that? And we have more studies now because it hit them first, right? So it's not hitting dance professors and those in chemistry labs, right, that need some type of physical presence. It hit them first and hard. That being, the domain expertise, they're the most still the most resistant, right? Because fundamentally, the skills that they believe are the most important, just like I would think that they would have to be able to identify slides, right? So like artist title date back in the day, being able to have this rote memorization skill to move forward. They believe they need syntax level writing for coding, and they need sentence level writing for grammar, syntax to understand how to actually communicate. So to answer your question, many of them aren't doing anything, and there's a reason they don't have incentive to do anything yet. But also those that do really want to do something are not given the guidance, the professional development, or the alternatives of being okay. So now you're telling me that we need to also admit that the majority of college students take their classes online. Even the ones living on campus, the majority of classes they take are online. And so there's not a single, right now, online assessment that an AI tool cannot hack in some way, right? So, but that's because we're leaning on an assessment strategy that goes back, to the founding of academia. Even if you want to go back to the first academy in ancient Greece, which is, which is examinations, right, whether it be oral or written, and then presenting research, usually in the form of a research paper, right? So those are the two most common forms of assessment that we still have, both of which are horribly outmoded and don't work anymore. Number one, they don't work in terms of assessment because, once again, as you mentioned, right, so the way in which content is created, undeniably moving forward, I mean, this is in Microsoft Word, right? So every word processor has this in it. Google has it integrated into every single product they have, right? Google Docs, Google Sheets, everything. And so this is how we write. The question is now, how do we know what students know when they turn in a paper, right, that they wrote with this? That's the assessment question that people really have. But to answer your question, that was twofold. That being one, awareness of the technologies, no. That being all the conferences that we go to, and both of you are painfully aware of this, the peer review process in academia and publication cycle is painfully slow, much slower than the development of these tools, which have bypassed or way far bypassed Moore's Law, right, back in 2023. I mean, the head of NVIDIA said we've had a million-fold, right, improvement since 2023, right? So that is that's an exponential rate that we can't keep up with verification terrifying. So as an example, I had an English professor who is staunchly opposed to any type, even brainstorming, even outlining, even anything with these tools. And I said, okay, so then, so why don't you show them how to do it? Use it yourself. They refuse to use it themselves, by the way. And they're like, because there's not best practices research out there yet to show me why and how to do it. And I'm like, that's because you're not doing it, right? So you have to do it in order to get the best. I'm in international conferences this spring that are citing what they think AI can do from studies from 2023. So if you think of GPT 3.5, hallucination rates, they're talking about red teaming it, they're talking about biases, and they're talking about like all kinds of things that today are not a concern. So anytime you demo or tell them that we have PhD level capabilities with the Pro series, that goes back to December of 24, we're met with disbelief, vehement disagreement that no way can it do what they do. But even when they do see it, it's a complete shock. It's a complete surprise. So no, they are not aware of it.
James, what you're outlining is something that unfortunately resonates with many of us. The concern that the traditional model of higher education just isn't equipped to deal with the rapid change, the evolution. The AI is a significant challenge to higher ed, but it's not the only challenge. And so I hear from many colleagues and administrators, they're also facing the demographic cliff. They're looking at funding cuts, what's going on with the federal government and grants. There are a lot of different challenges they're facing, but honing in on AI as a threat, is AI really an existential threat to higher education? How might the reaction to AI by higher ed maybe even change the nature of that threat?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That being, I was giving a presentation to a K through 12 school system just yesterday, and one brought up, that these AI tools that teenagers are using are going to exacerbate, them not developing certain social skills. And I'm like, this is the exact same argument that we had back with social media and smartphones, right? So the same concern over isolation, etc. In the same way, we had a myriad of problems that were compounded together, right? So you had various constituents wanting different things from higher ed, right? So that being, the parents wanted, career outcomes. The students thought it should be vocational. The faculty thought it should have to do with their particular focus or developing the whole human, right? So politicians, wanted specific outcomes, etc. And so, all of those various pressures are what most C-suites and boards are still focused on is, okay, this AI thing, that's your problem, right? You deal with that in the classroom. We're going to talk about the enrollment cliff. We're going to deal with, once again, retention. We're going to deal with tuition, right? We're going to deal with the problem with these grants that we're not getting into the funding for anymore. So you're right. The attention is still sucked away, right? Being redirected to the previous problems before we had all this. But to answer your question, as far as AI, because it's not being addressed, it's just growing bigger and bigger and bigger. So where we started, the abilities of most college professors in even November 2022, when we had the first soft launch of GPT, weren't that far off. We could have done something about it at the time and started thinking about, as this moves, how do we adjust with it? But because we ignored it for so long, the vast majority of those in academia, the gulf that we have here between where we're still at and how it keeps moving, further and further away from the awareness and the abilities of academics, the more it does become an existential threat. It doesn't have to be, but it will fundamentally reshape all levels of education at different different levels and increments, right? So as I say, kindergarten is going to be hit last because I don't see them parents wanting their 5-year-olds to be 8 hours a day with a robot alone, right? So I don't see the social emotional development aspect, but just they're not comfortable with it. They're creeped out by it. But the further up you go, I mean, you have most college students taking classes mostly online, and then graduate school, right, to where you're supposed to work almost entirely independently and then report back periodically, maybe every 6 months, maybe even a year, depending upon your thesis or dissertation advisor. Yeah, so you're going to see this domino-like change depending upon the need for human intervention, the types of skills and tools needed and the assessments, but expectations in the discipline. So everyone, kept talking about hallucinations, etc. But certain disciplines aren't bound by external accreditation or external types of rule settings and mandates that they have to meet, right? So, like with paramedics or some of these others that are more kind of metric driven, we kind of make up the rules as we go in a lot of disciplines, right? It kind of, we set the standard, we set the curriculum, we decide, what needs to be read and taught and tested on, right? So it's not an external, right, focus. And that's kind of what academia is like, no, this is us, this is external. We decide as the subject matter experts what this is. So the short answer to your question is it is an existential threat for many reasons. The one that hit me in 2022, which we'd already done 8 studies at that point, was that the model of secondary, post-secondary, and graduate education as how we traditionally move up was moot. That being in the undergraduate degree, I don't care what it is, right? I don't care if it's business administration, chemistry, history, poet, whatever the degree is, it's all the same. You have the fundamentals of your general education, generally agreed upon by a state. So your math, your state history, your U.S. history, your literature, your art, So we have that. You have the introductory level vocabulary and intro to a given field, so you're able to know the basic methodologies, the basic vocabulary, so you can talk about it. And then you work your way up to a capstone, which is just here's where we are in the field, right? So really, it's just getting them up to speed by the time they graduate with their bachelor's. Well, you can do that immediately right now. That's what AI does, is it can summarize in incredibly complex ways exactly where we're at in a field. So now what, right? So then really, undergraduate education becomes graduate education, because if they can already do that and output that, and the point of graduate education is creating new knowledge for a field and innovating for a field, then really we just kind of collapsed that whole ladder, right? So that's the existential threat I don't know a lot have considered so far.
Yeah, and we can, I like been talking about, threats and obviously difficulties, right? But from what you're saying, there's at least the possibility of moving the ship,
Yeah.
right? Seeing back in December 2022, there's an opportunity. It was easier to move the ship, I guess I should say, is what you're saying. And it kind of every day of delay, right? It becomes more difficult to move the ship or reinvent the ship, to change the ship. But ultimately, like a ship has a captain, right? A ship has a leader. Like what type of leadership do you think is needed? Maybe first like at a university level, to start actualizing some of these change, and maybe it might come through some external type of leadership. Obviously, professors and that, like they have like you say, a lot of control over their content, but maybe whether it's some type of accreditation body or just government leadership. Where do you see some maybe potential leadership even stepping in above the university level, but from people who have respect by respect of university administrators and professors, maybe being able to reinvent the ship or steer it?
That is, you touched on the main problem that we're dealing with, in the sense that there is no one party or individual that can turn the whole ship. It's actually 4 different major parties in order to shift it, which is why we're not moving. But to answer your question about leadership, right? So you really need visionary leadership that can see beyond the problems that we're having right now, which is enrollment, retention, tuition, all this type of attrition from institutions, lack of government funding. You have state and private with different challenges, etc. And so, but even if a president, a board, and then the provost, right, chief academic officer, decides, okay, we're going all in on AI, they're counterbalanced in traditional faculty governance by, okay, but you can't tell me what to do in my classroom, right? And so, so they're at odds there, and they cancel each other out quite often. And the harder, so for instance, there was a wonderful book you both are very very familiar with at this point. Published in 2023, College President, entitled, this is about faculty being, I don't care what it is, I'm against it, right? And so there is this innate sense of and suspicion of anything administration wants to do, especially if it involves meddling in their department, their classroom, what they're teaching, and what they're expected to do. Highly suspicious, and they will cry academic freedom very quickly when it comes to that. Even if it has nothing to do with academic freedom, that's still going to be cited. But for leadership, really assessing and realizing this isn't going away. This is once again yet another, which is very painful to think of, another factor they have to bring into their modeling and their financial planning, in addition to the demographic cliff, federal funding uncertainties, right? So for instance, in my state here of Missouri, only 35% of graduating high school seniors this last May went on to college. Right, it was starting college this fall. So that's a shrinking number. The rest, a growing number, vocational training, nothing at all, going to the military, right? So those are growing. So we're talking already about a shrinking pool of potential applicants they had to begin with. And AI is just another one. And so it just seems like another nuisance that can be put off, until later. But the visionary leadership will say, no, this is going to, within 5 years, severely impact our institution if we don't have a plan. Whether that's going to be complete integration. There will be institutions, by the way, that will be completely AI free. I think of like sci-fi films like Surrogates, to where you have, these havens of human only, areas where technology is completely banned, right? So I'm sure you'll have a few of those, but that can't be the norm, right? So that'll be a vast minority of them. But yeah, so that's the type of thinking that you have to have, and then you have to socialize, right? So you have to start making people realize, I know this is an existential threat to you, your identity, your livelihood, your vocation, etc. But it's not going away, and it's going to exacerbate and speed up your fears if you don't address it, now, and have a plan to address it, because it's not slowing down. What is happening, interesting, you asked about GPT-5, and so we're finally starting to see what's going to happen in that. We're looking at the development of general use tools, right? So if you had the pro version of OpenAI's GPT, like I do, 2 days ago, you would have seen a plethora of models from 4.1, says good for coding, 4.5, advanced research, O3, great, O3 mini, O1 Pro, right? So, but the general public didn't know what all that was, or what the different models did. So the whole point is they threw them all together to have a general purpose model that's supposed to kind of guess. It's not doing a good job right now, by the way, but kind of guess what you want, right? So if it needs to go coding, deep research, just a quick, shopping list of things. But that's where we're moving, is kind of the expectation that AI will do anything at all times. But that leads to a further disconnect with understanding what it actually is, right? And what's possible. So that's kind of where AI literacy and AI skills need to be, because the general public have smartphones, they talk to Siri, they talk to Alexa, etc. And they think it's similar, right? But it's fundamentally different in use cases and purpose. And when you pair that with a physical body of some sort, right? So we're looking at a completely, a different society, let alone, and supposedly the goal of higher ed is to elevate society in general, right? So you have an educated populace, we have, economic growth, you have, less strain on healthcare and law enforcement, etc. And so that lowers costs, and once again is benefit for all. So a rising tide lifts all ships. But yeah, we're looking at more and more stronger but general use kind of tools, to where just as you saw the generalist thing kind of coming in, okay, now I need an analysis, now I need a spreadsheet, now I need a pitch deck, now I need a slideshow, now I need, once again, you to do deep research in the NASDAQ, right, etc. So kind of this level, and then you're going to have the hyper specialists that can take the tool, that know what the different ones do, and can go much further than they ever could before. Just like with research, we're talking about, we have to relinquish control, that we're not going to be able to keep up with everything that's being published, right? Because it can go very, very quickly. The example I gave to our administration in the winter of 2022, where I lost so much sleep realizing what this meant, was, okay, so just imagine this. you set up, a model that's going to ingest everything on a given topic. Like, I need a new prostate cancer drug, right? It's like, okay, go through, immediately ingest almost instantaneously everything that's been published on prostate cancer up to this point. It can do that, right? So, okay, so now that I know all that, okay, now output a kind of protocol, a methodology to develop that and then test it in an Internet of Things lab, right? So it's like, okay, here's the protocol. I'm going to send it over, right, to an Internet of Things lab, which can then work with this with mice or whatever it needs to, completely free of humans. Take the results, send it back to another model, synthesize the results, publish them in a medical journal, right, which then adds to that previous body of knowledge, and then rinse and repeat. But this process, right, can go in certain fields like physics, mathematics, chemistry, right? So rapidly, thousands of times, right, a second as we're moving forward. So we're going to have to develop protocols of, what are we when it comes to researchers and the whole system of higher education, right? So we're still subject matter experts, but we're more editors, we're more quality control, we're more putting up the systems to ensure that the very powerful AI, and we haven't even talked about quantum computing yet, right? So that's without quantum computing, is going to be doing its thing. But yeah, that's the irony between that the models are exponentially growing in power and capability, but at the same time, knowledge of the different types of capabilities is dropping in many communities.
I really appreciate the way that you've outlined some of these forces in higher ed that many of us recognize. It's the butting of heads at times, but there is something to be said for that model of shared governance. I mean, I've chaired our faculty council, and have worked with colleagues and department chairs and administrators to try and grapple with some challenges that we're facing. I know that within your new book, which has just been published, The Adoption of Artificial Intelligence and Inertia in Higher Ed, Exploring Complex Resistance to Technological Change, that you've looked at some of the historical examples, and you're thinking about this. So let me play devil's advocate a little bit and say maybe there's something to be said for how this traditional higher education model provides a more thoughtful response. And so if we look at something like maybe even as simple as introducing calculators into mathematics courses, and the way that that was grappled with, and maybe it was a little messy at times, but now we've gotten to the point where we know how to best integrate it. Getting to your colleagues' response of we need best practices, we need to be able to explore this and be able to verify it. It seems like, one concern that you've already raised, and you've been able to really elucidate well, and I think most of our colleagues have heard, is that this is happening so much faster than you would find with other technological change. Is there more to it than just that? Is it really about the nature of the change, or is it really more about the rapidity of change that we need to adapt our model?
Yeah, and so you're absolutely right. That being, if we think back at calculators, and the example I always give, is as follows: we had time before, right? So the model of higher education. Let's just talk about academia and scholarship in general. Right. So the entire system of even the scientific method and publication is designed, right, in such a way to allow for those to review, right, of what's already known in the field by other experts, offer feedback and guidance, refine things or reject them if they don't need to be in the body of that field's knowledge, right, and then go through the process, right. So that cyclical process, though, for most disciplines in Q1 journals still takes a year or two, depending, right. So I know social science and many of the science journals are speeding that up incredibly rapidly because they're completely useless. A lot of the IEEE, et cetera, within a few months. But as far as the model for academia, you're right. It goes back to the year 1000, right? Kind of the University of Bologna and then later Oxford, in which you have this system of checks and balances, much like many governments, which ensure we don't move too fast and don't consider things and do our thoughtful research and reflection and verify, but that we move somewhat once all parties agree. right? But that takes a while, right? So if we're thinking about the time, Google launched in 1998, English faculty were sure that students would no longer be able to write a sentence because they would be thinking in search terms, right? So they were absolutely certain. Wikipedia comes out a few years later. It is the devil, right? So it once again, oh my God, anyone can put anything up there. Disinformation, misinformation. It's just awful. Now try to get something on Wikipedia, right? So it is very difficult to get something moderated on Wikipedia not taken down, right? So as a matter of fact, Wikipedia a year ago stated that they absolutely banned the use of any generative tools, right? So they're like the institution now, which is very interesting. But that took, right? So nearly 20 years, right? But then you have, social media, 2006 Facebook, smartphones, 2007. Okay, well now what do we do about smartphones in the classroom? And then you have cloud computing, right? So we the learning management systems, right? So once again, we didn't have everyone on the same page with pulling things from the gradebook and learning management system until around 2015, right? So if you think about that, that took a while. We had them, but how we used them took time. And as you mentioned, from a leadership standpoint, the only way we got that done was making it a requirement. That being, everyone has to put their grades in the learning management system because that's how we do grade pulls and get them out, right, on their transcripts. So only because that was forced. And so in many cases, that is what leadership is going to have to do, is minimum use of kind of AI, right, and define what that means, right? So at least talk about it, at least demonstrate it, at least give students reflective exercises on it. But it's going to have to be, a minimum use kind of policy in that way. But to your point, you're talking about the way in which this works. Yes, if we are not basing it on what we're seeing and what we're actually getting out of our research on a truly earnest sense of wanting to find out how AI is actually the pros and cons going to be integrated into academia as a whole and then to each individual discipline, right? So that's what their jobs kind of are. And then what does it mean for policy? What does it mean for plagiarism? What does it mean for academic honesty? So all those other things. The problem with that, number one, even if we did do that, is if we made a policy for this fall, it would be completely irrelevant by the end of the term, right? So we'd have to have a completely different policy because completely different use cases and abilities are going to develop, not to mention cultural uses and how we're going to see this evolving in our daily lives. So there's that problem, but that's not what's really happening. What's really happening is, yes, governance structures, right? You have this type of inertia built in because the president and the provost want to do something as an initiative. Faculty council and or department chairs and or deans push back, right, for their own agenda, right? And then you're kind of at this deadlock. And then, of course, we're not even talking about HR and IT, right? So kind of as far as leadership, Stefan, that's what we're talking about, is that's the holy trinity you need together, and that's not happening. Is that you'll have a president saying, we're going all in on AI, and then you'll do all this PD setup and this training, and then IT will say you can't use it. I did a training, once again, at an institution for 9 hours straight, at the end of which IT says, that's great, you can't use it on campus, right? Completely undermining everything that we're showing them they can do with it. Yeah. And then you have HR. I mean, so HR has to come in and say, yes, you can use this per your contract, and it's not a violation, right, of your job. So all three have to be in sync in their messaging, and they're not, right? So I can't think of hardly any example to where they're all in sync, because AI is the gatekeepers, and this is an existential threat to them as well, right? Because IT, no longer can stop you from doing something which is a general use tool. But anyway. So that's kind of the leadership side if we're talking about what we would need to do to that. But so we have the governance structure. We also, of course, have a lack of training and resources. When this happened, we did studies first. The instrument, we shared our information with Ithaca Research. They took it and shared it with other R1s. And what they got back is what we got back, in that it's not an administration problem, it's a teaching problem, right? You deal with that, you decide what you want to do with it on the ground, and then 9 out of 10 faculty universities still today have a statement in their syllabi stating you cannot use AI in this course because they don't know what else to do, right? That being, it's like, if I let them use it, you have to specify when they can use it. Think of the high school student who sued because he was failed, lost a scholarship because he wasn't told he couldn't use it for research. They knew they couldn't use it for writing, but you didn't say I couldn't use it for research. So that means they don't know what to specify because they don't know what it can do and the workflow. So we have that, a lack of training and resources. That being, if a faculty really wanted to integrate AI, and a lot of our business faculty actually are like, we're seeing this in employers. Amazon stated that every employee has to show how they're using AI for efficiencies. Shopify CEO says, show me you can do something AI can't, or you're not getting hired. So business faculty are saying they're going to need this. And so, but they don't know really what to do, right? So, okay, but then what do we do to help them, get prepared to be AI ready? So lack of resources and training. But really the big one is going to be identity and tradition, right? So that being, that's what we're talking about with computer science and English faculty. If it can do what you do, then who are you now? Right, in this way. And so it goes beyond job insecurity in that way and displacement. It goes down to the core of your being. I mean, most academics I know are that they are the poet, they are the historian, they are a chemist, right? So that's who they are. And so you're threatening to take that away. But then there's so that's one thing that we really need to get past in the discussions, right? So in the discussions in 2023, anytime we tried to do any training on AI, we had everything laid out, right? We have all these steps, things we're going to show them, etc. We hit a wall in the first 5 minutes with discussions over ethics and plagiarism, right? So they wouldn't even consider it because they would stop and go, no, 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 it's stealing from creatives, it's fundamentally wrong. We had some wild analogies, right, that were very disturbing for what they were coming up with, including slavery, for instance. It was like, whoa, where did this come from, right? But you'll note that those gave way. We don't even hear notions of ethics. It changed to responsible use of AI instead of ethical use. It was all about ethics 2024. Now you're just hearing responsible AI. So they don't use that excuse anymore. So they move to a different one. But if you get past it, what's the thing behind the thing that's really they're fighting against? It's their professional kind of identity or the tradition that they're in. So the tradition of higher education is also under attack, right, in that way, because the future of higher ed, once again, is going to be one that fundamentally serves a broader audience, that fundamentally is more modular and has more on and off ramps. The 4 and 40 model, which is the biggest problem that higher ed was built on after the GI Bill, which is you go to school for 4 years, you have that career for 40 years and retire. That's gone, right? And so, but we haven't changed the model. The model still assumes you major in one narrow field and then you're going to be accountant the rest of your life, which is why when we have students come in, and they're saying, yeah, what are you going to major in, etc. And they say things like, oh, I'm going into accounting. We wince. We're just like, that is the number one profession that's going to be automated first, right? But their parents, are thinking that's how you get ahead. They were told if they get a degree in computer science and they program, they're set once again with tech jobs. Number one unemployment among Gen Z, computer science majors, right? So it completely flipped on what that is. So yes, if it's done right, and we are a good example of that though is, for instance, Anand, is faculty will not vote to get rid of their positions, right? And so, in a lot of the movement we need is resource reallocation. But to do that, you have to get the faculty on board with the elimination of certain positions. Maybe the faculty are moved over because we're looking at 39% of core skills, right? That being completely replaced in most professions by 2030. We agree on that as far as the different reports. 39%. So that being maybe they have to get a completely different degree like I did, right? And hop over and do this because it's a new position. Or they're part of the 59% that have to upskill, for basic, a basic new skill that is stacked on top of what they already do, right? So they have to have basic AI knowledge, fine. But again, we don't see in any of these examples people voting themselves out, right? And so it goes against self-preservation fundamentally.
Yeah, what would you say? We talked about like, a lot of the barriers and, some opportunities for hope, right? Like, Lindenwood, what are some of the things like, you worked on or led or, even just maybe stuff in your own, right?
Sure.
Whether working with students or hands-on that like you found to be like effective, that have made some changes, maybe, even at a micro level, and especially maybe any that you think, are in spite of all these barriers, practical to recommend that other people adopt.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so we started from the beginning, which led to at the very end our human-centered AI programming. So that's what all the research and best practices led to. But at the beginning, the first thing I did in 2021, given the mandate of looking at AI and higher ed overall, was I formed the AI ambassadors. And so, step one, I built it on a previous VR Champions initiative, which is how we got one person from each department who was interested in integrating immersive education into their areas. And that's how we determined what the use cases are. We built out libraries, we made new scenarios. Same thing, rinse and repeat. We was okay, so we need to see who's interested in or already using AI in their areas in all these fields already in our particular university. So this is best practice. Everyone should do this if they haven't already. Because no one's going to listen to someone from the outside. They need someone from inside of their department to say, no, 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 this is how I use it, right? So that absolutely has to happen because they're not going to listen otherwise. So from education to business to chemistry, math, English. So we did art, right? So every single one, we found a multitude of use cases for AI, but they were always under the hood, right? So they were always prepackaged, ready to go solutions where you were the passenger, not the driver, right? So they couldn't change or modify anything with the tools they were using. But that was number one, was an awareness, that being, oh, okay, it's already being used, right? So it's not a big deal. The second one, as far as classroom, it took us a long time and a lot of trial and error because we couldn't figure out why so many students were resistant to even using the tools. Like many of them, you said, okay, we're going to use these tools in this class. They're like, I'm dropping, right? I refuse to use it. I'm not going to. Or if they did stay in, we would get the survey results at the end for mixed method studies, and it would say things like, it's creepy, it's soulless, it's stealing from people. This is wrong, but we couldn't figure out what that was. And so really coming down to understanding human psychology and a needs assessment for your students is really important. What student population are you teaching to, right? So what we determined from all the various institutions that I mentioned earlier, we couldn't tell. It wasn't age, it wasn't gender, it wasn't race, it was none of that. It was what they were learning and how they thought they were going to use it. So if they were learning something that was their identity, like writing poetry, they rejected it outright. So you could even give them studies and go, here's 5 poems. We're all going to sit down and rank them and which ones are the best. They always chose the AI one, and then when they told them that, they're like, oh, it's awful, right? Anyway, but you have to be aware of, if you're in a vocationally oriented class, being careful how you introduce it. That being, if you introduce it in such a way and say, this can do what you thought you were going to do, they're going to shut down, right? So you always want to, this is very interesting as well. You want to talk about the negative last. So we did lots of studies, and so discussing the ethics, here's the bad parts, here's the problems, etc. If you do that up front, which you think would be best practices, they stop listening and they shut down. And it's just negative. You're setting the expectation up that it's negative. So you warn them and give them all the information, etc. at the end, and then they can apply what they've learned through that filter and lens. But really, if it is a skill that they see as core to their future job or identity, you put AI in the background. You don't foreground the capabilities. You still state that the skills that they're learning, such as sentence level writing or coding, are significant, but they need to be aware of, right, that this is the reality when they go out in the job market. It's good to know that. I'm teaching a coding class right now in Python. The first week, this graduate student asked, so why are we doing this? Because you just showed us with these low code, no code tools how it can do the exact same thing, right, etc. Like, here's why, right? So then we have to explain, here's the realities of what you're going out and why it's still useful to understand the habits of mind, right, in that way. That is, how do you think like a programmer? How do you think like a systems architect? How do you think like a physician, right? So what questions would you ask? What is your framework? What are your methodologies, right? Rote memorization is not as important, but they still need to understand those frames of mind. Okay, so that's a second best practice. The third, of course, is going to be policies. You need a clear policy which states this is the one thing that a lot of people hid behind for the first year at our institution was no, the policy doesn't say we can use it. It didn't say we couldn't, right? But it didn't specifically address what tools could be used and for what. So you need a very clear policy of what can be used by faculty and staff, right? So different for HR, fiscal affairs, academic services, etc., addressing the different types of concerns they have, which was really big in the beginning with data privacy. It's not as big of a deal now, so we stopped hearing as much about that. So policy, right? So clearly communicating, no, you can do it, okay? And then you need to have your professional development for faculty and staff there to show them how, right? So just saying, yeah, go for it, Wild West, which is what a lot of people are doing, then you get very inconsistent results because they don't really know what do I do with this, right? So because we still have that type of resistance. But moving on then to curricular development, looking at how specifically is AI going to impact my field? That's the best thing that faculty can do right now to benefit their students, right? So is it automating note taking, right, for physicians when they're going in and getting background information in medical histories? Is it going to be checking for any type of negative reactions that different medications would have for pharmacists going through learning chemistry? What is it actually used for now? And then knowing what they know about their field, which I don't, what likely is going to be the use case 5 years from now, right? And then start thinking about, okay, how do we start building that in and at least discussing it, right? And then by the end, giving them some skills so that there are going to be more marketable once they finish up. But yeah, so that's kind of the broad picture of get those on board, have them talk to their colleagues, right, to kind of spread, awareness, then enthusiasm, then use cases, develop clear policies. The biggest problem we have right now is the stoplight policy for syllabi, which is the no use of AI, some use of AI, and then go nuts, right? You can use AI for anything. The problem that we're having and that institutions, you look at reports, are having is they put in okay, you can use it for some things, right? Those that are like AI forward. But and it says, and we'll tell you where and when. So they're like, okay, but I wanted them to be able to use it for brainstorming and for putting rough drafts together and this, but I didn't want them to use it to take the exam, right? So, but they didn't say that, right? So the lack of clarity around that. I'm sorry, I probably went on too long. Please continue.
No, that
No,
was
that
really
was
great, James.
great.
Yeah. One thing that I really appreciate throughout this discussion is this thread about identity. As you pointed out, we're all very used to a very traditional model where you go to school for 4 years and you know what you're going to be. And not just do, but what you're going to be for the next 30, 40 years in your career. For faculty, I think we all have a lot of sympathy for someone who has dedicated their life to their discipline, and that's part of their identity, and it's very hard to let go of that. But you've also pointed out that for students, who haven't even invested that time yet, they've already worked with that assumption that what they're going to study is going to be their identity. At the very beginning of the conversation, though, you also noted the transformation that's going to occur over the next several years, where we have to really come to grips with the idea that many of us need to be generalists. And to have a very different concept of identity. And I think what it comes down to is purpose. For many of us, talking about how AI is going to influence and change society, it's going to change our understanding of purpose. If you could say a little bit about that, because I think much of what you've outlined is incredibly helpful, especially when we're thinking about what to do in our institutions and our classes. But it seems like some of that's fairly short term if this transformation is going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. So as I kind of reminded, we look at and rank schools based upon graduation rates of cohorts of 5 years. So we give them 5 years to finish up a bachelor's degree, not 4 years of what they're expecting. So what that means, as I pointed out, is the class of 2030, the year we're all pointing to as critical for change, is starting here in a few weeks. All right, it's starting this fall. So it's not off in the horizon, the ones that we are educating as freshmen starting at the last week of August generally are going to graduate the year all this hits. So it's not far off and theoretical, right? It is, we're going to see more, at least economists predict that we're going to see more change in the next 5 years as far as, economics, structuring, jobs, the workforce than we did in the last 200 years, right? So that is a lot of change in a small amount of time and very difficult to wrap your mind around. So in other research, we started looking at we hear and we know what's happening. We see the downsizing in tech jobs, tens of thousands of them. We see the return to work orders, which many economists state are kind of smokescreen for down or right sizing their workforce because of what AI can do. We're seeing the freezing of entry level jobs for Gen Z, right, that just came out, and the rising unemployment for that for that age group. So we're seeing the impact already, right, of what's happening. So the first step is, of course, just saying, okay, this is happening, right? So that's kind of the first thing we need to get through in order to propel or get any type of momentum moving forward. The second question is, okay, what do we do about it, right? Or what's going to happen? The problem is no prognostication or model that we have, because the Stanford 800 model was thrown out the window because we automated creative work first, and blue collar work is coming with robots, right? So it completely flipped on its head. So no one really knows the time frame and disagree. We know it's speeding up. We know we're going to lose, right, 90 million jobs and create 170 million more. But that means we still have to retool all those people for jobs we don't know what they are yet. So that's why really looking at the future of education, it requires a massive restructuring, because you're going to have to make room for the millions of workers now that need new skills, and the structure of the 4-year degree doesn't really align with that. So we're going to have to start thinking about, and what skills are we teaching them? So as of now, if we're talking about restructuring higher education at the undergraduate level, think about what's actually needed, what everyone agrees with. So everyone agrees you need some basic AI skills, some basic, back in the day it was computer literacy. I had my first computer class. So you need to work Microsoft Office. You need to be able to open Word, right, and do an Excel spreadsheet. That's the basic stuff, right, that we need to kind of build in. That's not there. There's no required AI stuff in general education. So that's got to be there. Then take all the gen ed, as painful as this sounds, you can still teach it through the lens of philosophy, through the lens of literature, through the lens of mathematics, but the actual outcomes have to be those skills that we know are important, right? So that employers agreed on before the pandemic, right? So, communication, critical thinking, empathy, teamwork, leadership, right? So those are your outcomes, right? So if you get to them by teaching Shakespeare, that's great, right? But that's what the core needs to be of the education. Then moving on from there, you break down those. That's the biggest problem we have right now is many business majors, for instance, have such specific requirements that there's no room for any electives. And so, but they're tied into like accounting, right? Is a great example, right? So they're doing all their coursework for an eventual career in one narrow area of business, which we know the accounting firms realize is being automated, because you notice now their big selling point is, well, we don't need you. You don't need us to do your taxes, but we're going to help you try not to get audited. I don't know if you've seen those commercials. Because they know that's not what they're needed for. So their days are numbered. So get rid of that very narrow focus. There are still skills that we need, but think about in terms of meta majors, right? So that being a broad grouping of skills that are going to go together for this new generalist world. So, is it going to be the natural sciences? Is it going to be, business, right, in this way, but broadly speaking, right? Is it going to be, but the point is that with those, you can group these kind of like skills together, whether it's quantitative skills, qualitative skills, right? So various business skills, interpretive skills, humanic skills, whatever that might be, but they need to be flexible, right? And they need to be able to think broadly and adapt quickly. So the most important outcome, though, for education at this point is, and we did a very poor job of that when I was in school, is metacognition, right? I was handed thousands of pages, every week, as a grad student, and said, go read that and then come back and talk about it. No framework, no reason why, no methodological anything. It's just go figure it out, right? So that being. So what we need to do now is say you are using this to learn this specific thing. So skillifying the syllabus, which is what we do, right? This you're doing this for critical thinking, but then also clarifying you're going to do this to learn how you learn best, right? So and fastest. The person that can learn best and fastest and upskill more quickly will win, right? So in a manner of speaking, right? As far as being able to transition in this new economy by keeping your identity small and being willing and open. Everyone we've talked to that has transitioned well thus far has the same qualities and characteristics. They have a growth mindset. They don't think that they don't need to learn anything else. They're done. They're always like, oh, that's interesting. They always are learning new things. No one told them to. They're not being paid to. Their boss didn't tell them to, but they're always going out and learning new things. So you have that growth mindset. But the second one, which is interesting, is curiosity. They have an innate curiosity about the world. That's interesting, right? So those people, when AI came out, were like, that's interesting. I wonder what else it can do. I wonder if it can do this. I wonder if I can use it here, right? Innately curious, right? Which then led to them adapting easier because it didn't threaten who they were. But the skill set for students has to be what we know will prepare them for the future. That doesn't mean we have to do away with. We can't, right? So I'm not. So for instance, we're partnering with a company on a tool called Integravise, which is where students upload their papers or exams, and then a clone of the instructor comes up and then asks them about what they submitted, right? So that we can determine if they know what they submitted, right? So and you can grill them as long as you want. You can add rubrics, etc. That's a stopgap measure because for the next 5 years we're not getting rid of exams and papers, right? That's to get us through is tools like that. But completely rethinking in the interim. Okay, so we've got this going for the meantime. Now we need to completely rethink what we're actually doing to assess those. And that takes, you asked earlier about best practices. You got to bring students into the first conversations on how things are assessed, right? So you got to get buy-in to, you can say, here are the outcomes. Here's what you have to learn for this class. Now let's agree how we get there. How do you want to demonstrate that? Right? But we all have to agree, and once again, it has to be accessible, right? It has to be actionable. We have to be able to do it. But you still have to be able to do X, Y, and Z. And once you get that buy-in, students will enforce it with each other if they're the ones that made right that particular strategy. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, just in wrapping up a little bit, we've mostly talked about what professors can do, what administrators can do, leaders can do. You mentioned students coming in, right? They're going to be this class. Someone I work with referred to it as class of AGI, which I thought was creative, right? But when we're heading into 2030, whether we call it AGI or just some radical change, that's the world that they're going to graduate into. One of those is my own son. He'll be starting college this fall, and I was thinking, I want to give him some advice about AI, which is a little hard because if I bring up AI, he kind of doesn't want to talk about it, but other times he's brought it up. Once he said, "Well, what kind of work are people going to do?" This was just like he was just sitting there. We were kind of watching TV, and he kind of brought this up. And then the other day he brought up, he's like, "Have you seen these things like where you can't tell if the person's actually the person?" That really, I think he just saw it on TikTok or something, but that really disturbed him. So I was thinking, what kind of advice, would I give him? I mean, the one thing is, of course, to develop, whether we call them the soft or durable skills, work on opportunities for that in college, to try some of the tools, I'm definitely willing, to pay for a tool, and you can access some of these for free. The other thing I thought is like, if you're ever falsely accused, come see me. I got you on this one. The fourth, I was like, but also like, don't professors are in different places, right? So, try to take courses with professors who are going to help you integrate this into the workflow and understand. But, you don't, you just have to accept, that people are in different places. I wonder, what you might think of some of those pieces of advice, or what advice might you encourage me to give my son, or, just advice you have to kids entering college or in college now.
You brought up a great point, which our research confirms that being Gen Z is the hardest to upskill in AI, right? And rightfully so. They were the last generation. You mentioned, kind of AGI as far as higher education is concerned, but they were the last generation to go completely through secondary education with one set of expectations, and then the world changed, and those are no longer valid. So they feel cheated. They feel very ambivalent about technology. Even before AI, they really idolized the 1990s, right? It's like, look, not a cell phone in sight, right? Everything was simpler, right? So they have this love-hate relationship with technology to begin with. And you're right. I was talking to the mayor here, and his grandson. He was saying loves to write, and so won't even talk about it, right? It's just like I love writing, etc. Can't even imagine that that's part of the world in this way. So the first, and so it's a very complex again, shifting of expectations, as you were mentioning, of identity, right? So what they thought they were going to be is being fundamentally challenged, because when they graduate, that job might not exist. I mean, many of the jobs they're going to might not exist. And so that's kind of step one, right? Is teaching them that their job that they think they're going into is not their identity, right? So that's the hardest thing for us to shake in America. You go up, you meet someone, you go, Stefan, how's it going? All right, what do you do? That's the first thing we ask, right? Because we tie identity with job. So that's kind of the first thing, is showing them that you are, as a parent, modeling it more than your job, right? So you go out, your father, husband, you might like fishing, you might like, whatever it is that you like doing, but showing a diverse range of interests, skills, and hobbies. So that's one of the things in which we can recommend for them. As well, don't focus solely in one specific area. That is fundamentally one of the best recommendations that I have for students, because we don't know. What we do know are the skills that matter. So don't think that they need to major in something in order for them to have a successful career or to be safe financially, because that is not true anymore. What they need to do is major in, if they're limited, right, to majors now. You can do interdisciplinary studies. No one knows what that is, but major in something that they're passionate about, so that if they're in a class, as you mentioned, with a teacher that doesn't fully embrace, if they do like to use AI, if they don't, that they're still passionate about the subject. They're still passionate about what's happening, instead of just checking a box. And they're more likely to learn those skills we talked about, if they are passionate and invested in what's happening in this relationship. I would always say, 20 years ago, right when I started teaching, that even if you, to my mentees, even if you absolutely hate the person that's teaching, you hate the subject matter, you see no point in it, trust me, or you think you know everything, right? So you go in there, you focus on what they can offer you, because you can get something and an experience and a skill out of every scenario if you're open to it. Right? You need a growth mindset in going into it. But really, yeah, it's diversifying a set of interests. It's getting basic AI literacy. If he doesn't want to, learn all the ins and outs of the different types of models, that's fine. But what the number one thing that we are cheating students on is not showing them what it can actually do. So that's what I tell them, that being, you can't get hired for Shopify or Amazon now unless you know what the AI can do and you differentiate yourself. Bare minimum, you need to know that. So like keeping up with, oh, okay, it can code, it can do this, all right, but it can't do this, right? So it can't debug itself with these specific, these low code things. We still need back end, kind of developers to do that, etc. So that's kind of it. So just keeping up with, roughly what the capabilities are, diversifying interests, right, and skill sets, and focusing intentionally on developing those durable, transferable, we call them power skills, for instance. And so there are different ways to do that. If he's an introvert or an extrovert or some of those, very broad categorizations, my son would just stay in his room and play video games all day if he could. He wants to be a game designer, or does he like sports, right? So developing teamwork by a sport. If he doesn't like sports, how do we develop that skill of teamwork or leadership, giving him the idea of being over a project, or once again, developing different communicative strategies. That's kind of the big confusion that a lot in the humanities have, is a jobs report just came out, and the top skills, the number one is communication. So what they think that means is traditional writing, right? Like composition. But what employers actually mean is knowing how to communicate to different audiences, different ideas, right, across different media. That's really what they mean is, how do I communicate short and sweet in this pitch deck, right, to this person? You got 10 seconds to give me your elevator pitch, you're done. Or do I need to, once again, give backstory and let them know a little bit about, who I am and buy in and develop a relationship? But being able to know the difference and be able to switch between them, right? So that's really what they mean. But anyway, I have the book we can talk about, next time, which addresses specifically that as far as from a parenting standpoint.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for your time, a lot of time today. And we look forward to following up. Yeah, I saw you as I was going through all your publications. I saw many in the book for the giving the advice to the parents.
Yeah.
Did
So
you have
this is
anything you want to follow up?
yeah, but this has been
Yeah.
fantastic, James. Thank you for your time and so much to think about. For any of us who want to follow your work, where can we find you?
Yeah, easiest way, LinkedIn. So you just put in my name, James Hutson, Hutson. I'm the first one that comes up. The more we can have in this network of varying perspectives and different ideas, the better. So contact me. You can, of course, find me on the university webpage as well at lindenwood.edu. Happy to discuss further.
Excellent. Thanks again for
All right.
being here. We look forward to following the discussion, hopefully in a future episode.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Everyone have a great day.